We have now arrived at what will be the last section of the critique dedicated specifically to gameplay. At least, before the DLC, anyway. So obviously I've talked quite a lot about Elden Ring's difficulty, but up to this point, it's only been in the framings of whatever it was that I happen to be discussing. Now that I've talked so much about the gameplay, mechanics, enemies, and so on, I think it's high time I gave an overall assessment of Elden Ring's approach to difficulty. Elden Ring's approach to difficulty on the whole is extremely artificial, and the lack of balance has rightfully become a major point of critique for many players. As a person who's been playing these games since the days of Demon's Souls and has become so familiar with what it was that made the difficulty of those games as strong and fine-tuned as it typically was, the artificiality of Elden Ring's difficulty is glaringly transparent. FromSoft knew their games had gotten quite popular and so tried implementing a number of tricks to throw off their many veteran players. However, the end result was far from the cleverly nuanced design they probably had envisioned. The first and most obvious issue that many players will find is the constant use of delayed attacks. These are so unsubtle in their implementation that it's become a meme amongst fans of the game just how ridiculous some of this shit looks. FromSoft has always done well at maintaining relative realism and internal consistency with their games. Every now and then things would get a little over the top, but you could tell even then that it was never going out of its way to be something it wasn't. Be it a humanoid boss like Gehrman and the Nameless King, or a bestial encounter like Ludwig's First Phase or Midir, previous From games never tried to break the consistency of their world for the sake of throwing players off. Every now and then you might get the sluggish wind-up, like with Vendrick or the Adjudicator, but there was always a context that you could intuit solely from the visual presentation. Again, typically. Orgot holding his weapon up for as long as he does isn't contextualized in any way, and it makes the player raise an eyebrow when they take a significant chunk of damage from an attack that realistically shouldn't carry very much momentum. Like, yeah, no shit dodging an attack is going to be difficult when there's no visual consistency to follow. Dodging is no longer a skill because of this, it's a memorization tactic that you develop and fine-tune through repeated play. Developing an acumen for iframing individual attacks isn't the same as coming to understand the enemy as though it were a living, breathing entity that you're trying to overcome through skill and determination. Previous games may not have always hit the mark on this, but you could tell that it was what they strove for and why those games were as engaging as they were. And another thing, can we cool it with the overtuned bosses and just utterly bloated kits? At a point it just becomes mundane to deal with. Yep. There's the AoE, alright, there's the wombo combo, watch out for the command grab, nice, okay, yeah, AoE number 2, cool. Alright, time for phase 2, and there's the one shot. Let's be honest, I just described at least half of Elden Ring's 171 bosses, or 238, or however many there are. More than anything, I think it's the non-stop happy feet wombo combos that annoy me most of all. None of these are Falco, they ain't Falco. Like, where are the breaks even at? Where are they at? Where are we at? Oh my god. Wombo combo. No, but seriously, why can't these bosses just shut the fuck up and give me a turn? The frustration in Elden Ring doesn't even necessarily come from the difficulty. It just gets annoying having to wait so long for a boss to finish their seemingly never-ending combos so I can finally get my one attack in, 2 or 3 if I'm feeling especially greedy. That's also assuming they don't have some sort of contingency in place to punish me for even trying, or that the lock-on actually keeps my focus on them. Honestly, half the punishes I even take anymore, not counting the stuff from the DLC because it's kinda new at this point, are completely self-inflicted, like knowing I can tank a hit or two and just not having the patience to wait for the boss to finish like we're in Fake Taxi or interviewing on the casting couch, alright? I have needs too. It's really irritating to wait as long as 12 seconds for an enemy to stop attacking when my window for response is less than a 1/12 of that. Like, imagine you're being interviewed, but you're immediately interrupted with the very next question every time you go to speak. You get these insanely elaborate questions and are expected to give no more than one-word responses, and it's on you to make sure those one-word responses stack up into a cohesive interview. That is Elden Ring's combat, or at least that's how it feels most of the time. I understand that there is an argument to be made for hit trading as a valid strategy, but it doesn't feel nearly as satisfying when the reward is just beating the boss in a very average span of time. How long a boss fight should or shouldn't go is obviously subjective and dependent on the game in question. However, I don't think it's unfair of me to say when so much of a fight in an already meticulous RPG with notable gaps in activity is just pressing circle and watching a giant malformed man do cartwheels, or an enormous dog clad in heavy armor fly through the sky with the faint sound of Sortrick sword echoing in the approaching storm. It can get pretty tiring after boss number 151, okay? It just comes off as really try-hard when the developers try to give so many enemies such ridiculously long chains of attacks. Like, do the Banished Knights really need to be this aggressive? I doubt it. I know I'm highlighting bosses mostly, but this isn't exclusive to them, not by a long shot. It'd be one thing if these combos were extremely sparse and reserved for bosses like Malenia and Hoaraloo, but can somebody please explain why Margit is able to do as many as 15 hit combos? Bloodborne and Sekiro had their share of lengthy combos, but the Hunter and Sekiro were designed to be able to cleverly and effectively manage that degree of offense. The Hunter was much faster than the Ashen One or the Tarnished, and Sekiro's kit was built around blocking and deflecting enemy attacks so as to exploit the openings and break enemy posture. Dark Souls was never equipped to handle enemies of the caliber present in Bloodborne and Sekiro, and yet despite Elden Ring's player character being identical to the one in Dark Souls 3, many of the enemies behave just as aggressively, if not more so, than the Orphan of Kaz or Geneshiro and Ishin. The aggression of Elden Ring's enemies is an issue that's led many to believe that these kinds of enemies were basically designed with Spirit Ashes in mind, with the instances that Spirit Ashes aren't accessible serving as spikes in difficulty, which in turn further highlighted their viability outside of those scenarios. After all, being able to manipulate enemy aggro is an extremely powerful tool to take advantage of. Plus, the very idea of Spirit Ashes wouldn't even make sense were it not for enemies being so much more aggressive on the whole. Otherwise, they just wouldn't even be able to handle that kind of system. However you look at it, the extreme levels of aggression in the enemy AI feels very tone-deaf on the part of FromSoft. Souls fans have always been selective with the mechanics they like to engage with, that's just the nature of RPGs. Earlier From games always had practical ways of accounting for these preferences. Don't feel like burdening yourself with a sturdy shield? Worry not, because now you'll be able to carry another piece of gear like a staff or a talisman. Want to use magic that's more defensive than offensive? Try out Miracles. Don't feel like summoning other players? No problem. The game's built to account for both single-player and multiplayer boss fights. Well, mostly. Look, they were always trying, okay? Elden Ring doesn't really have anything to offset a refusal to use Spirit Ashes. If you don't use them, you're only putting yourself at an immediate handicap, and it definitely shows against the more aggressive bosses like Malekith and Malenia, and don't even get me started on the DLC. Not using Spirit Ashes can obviously make for an interesting challenge. I just wish there was something else to it than the self-inflicted challenge. Just some kind of offset to be like, okay, you're not taking advantage of this mechanic, so we're gonna throw you a bone to better optimize your experience. It's weird too because I honestly think the boss AI is mostly fine when the player is using their Spirit Ashes, at least outside of the DLC. They regularly change their target, again outside of the DLC, making them far less easy to manipulate and thus keeping the player on their toes at all times. And yes, there are some Spirit Ashes that are pretty overpowered, but that just kinda leads into my next point. Elden Ring, much like Dark Souls, is nowhere near as hard as people make it out to be. It definitely tries to live up to the studio's reputation of being the ones that make the super duper hard games, but this is completely undermined by just how many overpowered builds and tools exist in this game. Even after the many nerfs and balance patches that dropped in Elden Ring's first few months following launch, and most recently the patches that have followed the release of the DLC, there is still an absolute abundance of overpowered weapons, spells, ashes of war, build summons, and so on. As an aside, it's also very telling that of Elden Ring's many overtuned enemies and bosses, the only notable nerf that came out was for Radahn because that's the one that people were collectively complaining about. I don't pretend that I remember the specifics of the nerfs, but I do remember my own experience with Radahn, and I have the footage right here for a review, so what I can say is that I actually didn't have that much trouble with them. Huh. I guess difficulty really is subjective. Huh. Back on topic though, even with weapons like the Sword of Night and Flame, Rivers of Blood, or the Moonveil Katana getting the nerfs they did, Elden Ring is still ripe with overpowered shit to exploit. Rivers of Blood is still top tier and not to mention very easy to acquire. Malekith's Black Blade is hilariously overpowered. Frost and Bleed builds are still complete and total boss breakers. Reduvia is extremely powerful even in the late game and you can find it in Limgrave. Comet Azure can still be used to melt a boss's health bar the moment you walk through the fog gate. Even basic Unga Bunga strength builds that dual-wield great axes can completely flatten most bosses in a handful of seconds by just spamming jump attacks. This is legitimately a high-tier strategy. Whether you're looking to invest in strength, dex, intelligence, faith, or the arcane, there is plenty of OP bullshit for you to find for quite literally any and all possible builds. And don't even get me started on the Mimic tier. I love using this thing as much as the next guy, but you can get away with so much if you fit it with the right weapons or spells. Here's your reminder, this thing has infinite magic. This is why I want to make it clear that many of my issues aren't solely to do with the game being quote-unquote too hard. You can cry skill issue all you want, but this isn't just to do with the game being hard, it's also to do with the game being ridiculously easy. There is a lot that goes into crafting difficulty. For every instance of Elden Ring going out of its way to bust the player's balls, there's either an instance of the game being exceptionally easy, or there being something that you can exploit to turn the game into a complete and total pushover. I'd also like to remind you once again to ignore what gatekeepers for this game have to say regarding the subject, because to them, if you take advantage of the game's more powerful assets, that makes you a scrub for opting for the easy mode because you couldn't get good. If you don't use an optimal build, it's because you're an idiot scrub that needs to get good. There is no winning with these kinds of people. If you need proof, just look at my fucking comments section. So just don't bother. The appeal of the game as an RPG is the build freedom, and that's absolutely there, so just go nuts and have fun with it. Who gives a fuck what any of these douchebags think? All of this is to say that Elden Ring's problem isn't that it's too hard or that it's too easy. Elden Ring's difficulty problem is far more nuanced. It's about balancing, and I think the scope of the game simply meant there was simply too much for this studio to account for. On a subjective level, I don't mind when a game has overpowered builds and options. You can get utterly fucking busted in games like Borderlands, but that's also half the fun. I understand Borderlands doesn't have the PvP to concern itself with, like Souls games, but Souls PvP was also a mistake, and might very well be impossible to balance so long as the focus of these games is so heavily centered around the PvE. But the real issue with Elden Ring versus a game like Borderlands is that Elden Ring is going out of its way to try and craft a particularly difficult challenge. And it's difficult to take that challenge seriously when it can be broken so easily. Even Melania, the Blade of Mikola and the Goddess of Scarlet Rot, Mrs. Hardest Ever Super Duper Boss herself, can basically be made into a complete and total joke with the right gear. I would know. I've done it. I honestly want to know what FromSoft intends to do with their next game, and then those that come afterwards. Are they just going to keep ramping things up until their games become physically unplayable? Are we going to keep seeing these hilariously broken strategies and builds that turn the capstone challenges into meme material? At what point do they start to reflect on their work and say, okay, maybe we can cool our jets here just a little bit? This whole culture that they've cultivated for making hard games just for the sake of making hard games is becoming more of a headache than it's worth. I love challenging games. There's a reason I fell so in love with games like Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and so on. But if all we're getting moving forward is retreads of past games but harder, I'll just stick to watching the Vati lore videos and checking out the OST. By the way, I just gotta ask, why do people always dunk on sorcery as if it's the most OP shit when faith builds are the actual gigachads of these games?